I want to move on because we got limited time now. I want to finish up with the idea of the Black Boogeyman syndrome, and I'm going to pass this to Dr. Curry. Dr. Curry, we talked at the top of the space about this idea of the black men being demonized and black men basically being forced out of the academy or being painted as basically inhuman devils. I want to take it out of the academy into some of the effects of this. Um, Anti-black misandry. You know, we know about what it looks like in academia, but we've seen the manifestation of anti-black misandry in health and
Absolutely.
psychology, in the legal field. Almost every week we see a story where somebody who is working, who has the degree or their field is in, law or field or health, psychological or counseling, academia, says something hateful about black men and boys. And these people go out into the world and they go out to try to serve the public with these same attitudes. Can you talk a little bit about how the demonization of black men can go out from black people into other black people who matriculate through this idea?
Yeah, I mean that's a multi-tiered process. But I wish William A. Smith was here. Um, he does fantastic work on the health implications and the allostatic load that black men suffer because of racial misandric aggression. And one of the things that I think is so important is that when we're talking about anti-black misandry, which is a term that was partially coined by William A. Smith. He talked about the idea of black misandry. Um, is that we understand that there are negative ideations, there's negations of black men and boys in the United States, and this has very different effects on how they conceptualize themselves, how they experience stress, and how they understand themselves in relationship to a largely hostile environment, be it social, communal, or an education institution. Now, I wanted to start with his framing of that because I think what often happens is that people miss that the negations of groups in a particular society like the United States has real effects on how they see themselves, how they behave in the world, and how other people perceive them, right? So we're talking about the role that anti-black misandry plays in a specific group like black men, then we're not only going to talk about higher rates of depression, higher rates of high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, which is often affected by stress, but we're also going to talk about how people perceive black men as being vulnerable to certain forms of violence. So one of the contributions that the Man Not makes is that it theorizes the way that child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, intimate partner violence happens because the perpetrators of that violence, be they black men or black women, do not see black men as having worth. So internalized vulnerability would be a situation in which, because the society does not value black men or think their lives have value, the group they're surrounded by perceive them as also not having value. And that allows the group to then decide how they should be treated. We also see this when we look at genocides, right? Because if you look at how certain Jewish people, Armenian people treated each other, or Rwandans treated each other in the Rwandan genocide, you can see that there's an internalization mechanism of negative stereotype ideation from the dominant group to the subordinate group. So anti-black misandry, contrary to the kind of Twitterverse, is describing a dynamic that we can actually verify, both epidemiologically in terms of the outcomes that black men have in hostile environments and their own households and communities, and as a larger structural kind of apparatus that allows us to talk about internal racism or internalized self-negation attitudes that we see throughout racial ethnic conflicts and genocides. That being said, it puts us in a very peculiar position because what we see now is the proliferation of negative stereotypes about black men and boys, largely under the guise of female liberation, that's assumed and absorbed not only by other black people in the community, but also white liberals. This means that black men are always on high alert because they are suffering from stereotype anxiety. They're constantly being framed, constantly being opposed, constantly being compressed by the vision and characterological assumptions that other people make of that group. The effect of this, of course, is lower motivations we see with young black men in schools and various education structures, disengagement, antisocial behavior, all to protect how black men see themselves from those kinds of imposing structures. This is not a neutral endeavor. This is not to say that only black women perpetrate this kind of violence. It's not to say only black men do. What black male studies scholars are trying to suggest is that anti-black misandry, like other forms of marginalization, are reproduced. They are both internalized by the subordinate group in terms of how black people also recognize black men and boys as possible threats and dangerous, and they're also controlled and imposed and filtered down to the subordinate group by the dominant group, like white people. So the kinds of analysis that we see with gender theory is largely inaccurate. And I want to be very clear about this. It's not inaccurate simply because I disagree with it. It's inaccurate because the kinds of arguments that we get concerning black men and boys, say the mimetic thesis, that black men want to imitate white men, for instance, or white male patriarchy. We have multiple attitudinal measures that show that black men largely do not align with the value system that white masculinity in America has. They don't even align with the gender system that white women have, because black men, generally speaking, are more progressive and more egalitarian than any of those two groups. If black men aim to imitate the value system of white people, we should be able to see a sociological measure of black men actually imitating the values of white people. We don't find that. The other issue is that when black men self-define themselves, right, when black men are writing both narrative, testimony, or even qualitative survey about how they think about manhood, some of the work by Wisdom Powell demonstrates that this is not the case as well, that black men don't have a definition of masculinity that mirrors the white dominant group, but rather they actually have a concept of manhood that's much more communal, much more independent, and much more spiritual, right? So what it suggests to us is that not only are black men dealing with the imposition of these kind of alien concepts that are imposing violence and certain kind of psychological stresses and physiological stresses on them, but they're also resisting because they have a different value system that allows them to pull from, values to community, values connection to family, and basically opposing white masculinity. Now, I want to say one other quick thing. This issue of anti-black misandry is constantly ridiculed on Twitter, despite kind of the wealth of scientific information that supports it. So I just discussed, with William A. Smith's work on racial battle fatigue and misandric microaggressions says about this. That's proof positive that black men, even in educated or class elevated positions, suffer from certain forms of negation and existential crisis. But what I think is even more compelling at a structural level is when you look at how colonial and post-colonial societies operate, you see the same kinds of depictions and negations of racialized men throughout. So said differently, if you look at any Western society, in that Western society, you will find specific stereotypes, racist stereotypes, religious stereotypes, etc., that target men. This is not only confirmed in, say, the work of someone like a Joseph Massad, who looks at the role that Islam plays in being the enemy of liberalism in the UK and the United States and Canada, but you can also, of course, find this among social dominance theorists like Jim Sedanius, his subordinate outgroup male target hypothesis, right? Where he argues that if you're looking at racial or arbitrary state discrimination, multiple tests in terms of discrimination on housing, interest rates of loans, job discrimination, education, etc., shows that racialized men or subordinate men, because it could be a class, religious, or national origin thing, are discriminated against more severely than their female counterpart. Now, this dynamic that we're speaking about suggests to us that when we're in any kind of democratic society, you're going to have racialized men defined out of that society. So that means that we're not going to want them to participate. We should see them incarcerated more. We should see them killed more. We should see a lower relationship between them and education and social mobility. This is the kind of empirical proof of what we say anti-black misandry is actually doing and how it operates. It both exists at the level of ideation and it exists at the level of terms of material consequences. What's being denied today is that there are specific ideas and institutions that are exerting misandric aggressions around black men. So the idea is that if black men don't have an education to equal levels of their female counterpart, it's not because of specific anti-black misandry or arbitrary set discrimination. It's because black men are failures. If black men don't have as much money or a job or employment opportunity, it's because they're lazy. So what's happening is that even in gender theory, we have a deficit-based account of black males' downward mobility. What this justifies then is this kind of subcultural thesis that, well, look, when you look at black women, they have positive values, they have resistory values, they vote Democratic, we like them, they're friendly, and they're entrepreneurial. But black men, they're poor, dangerous, misogynistic, etc. Now, Joseph Massad's work says that you can see the exact kind of mirroring about Islamic men in relationship to liberalism. He says that when you look at Muslim men, if Muslim men reject the dominant ideology of liberalism, they say they're misogynist, sexist, against women's rights, and barbaric. Now look at what happens to black men. If you look at black men in the UK and the United States, they don't assimilate, they don't buy into the education system, they don't take on liberal democratic values. What do you say? They're dangerous, they're deviants, they're misogynistic, homophobic, etc. These patterns, these replicative patterns that we see about racialized men are treated across the Western world is the basis of how we have to start introducing a structural analysis and interventions into the mental health and the public health of black men within these repressed and oppressed societies. The constant denial of this by gender theorists, be they black feminists, black liberals, white liberals, etc., pick your poison, only sets us back because what it forces us to do is take anecdotal stories or incidences of black male violence and attribute that to deviance, instead of seeing that the kinds of violence that we see black men participating in are not only the outgrowth of a specific targeting, right, underemployment, unemployment, etc., but also part and parcel of the environments they're being confined to because of structural discrimination. So we have to get away from the moralization of black men and boys as deficit-based, pathologized, and failures, right? These kinds of aggressions that we consistently see prominent black feminist academics remind us of on Twitter, and start looking at the dynamics of racism, the dynamics of anti-black misandry, and how that actually affects us on the ground level. That's not going to be an academic conversation. That's going to be academics teaching practitioners, social workers, and clinicians what's actually happening, giving them the data and the social scientific proof, and then us thinking about how we can address the existential lacuna that's being formulated around black men and boys in a society that offers them no help, but constant degrading.
Thank you for that, Dr. Curry. Thorough as always.